Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into one of the most fascinating, high-stakes, and honestly kind of misunderstood roles in all of human history. We are talking about the Court Jester. And look, we're not just talking about some guy juggling in a floppy hat here. Actually, the Court Jester was literally the ultimate mechanism for delivering incredibly uncomfortable truths to the absolute highest authorities. We're looking at a role requiring mind-blowing bravery, razor-sharp intellect, and profound psychological importance.
Okay, let's dive into this. Think about it. Who is the most powerful person in a king's court? Well, if you're anything like most people, your immediate assumption is going to be the king, right? Or maybe a top military general, or some wildly wealthy noble. But I want to completely challenge that assumption today. Because the real answer, both historically and psychologically, might just be the one person nobody took seriously.
William Shakespeare actually captured this whole dynamic perfectly. He wrote, "The fool doth think he is wise, but the wise man knows himself to be a fool." It perfectly embodies this brilliant oxymoron we call the wise fool. It's a literal paradox, you know? The character we all label as the fool is actually the one holding the deepest wisdom. Just think about Socrates for a second. He's basically the archetypal wise fool. His entire educational method was built on exposing the folly of the supposedly wise people around him, and he famously claimed that his own true wisdom came purely from knowing just how ignorant he actually was.
Part 1. The Paradox of Folly. Let's look at why this is such a basic human need.
And this brilliantly illustrates the point. In our modern society, we have this massive tendency to take ourselves incredibly seriously. We're always striving for efficiency, for conformity, and we completely forget that playfulness isn't just fun, it's a basic human need. Look at the root of the word fool. It actually comes from the Latin word foles, which translates to a pair of bellows expelling empty air. It basically implies an empty-headed person. But wait, think about what a bellows actually does. It pushes the vital oxygen needed for combustion. So the fool might seem like a total windbag, but they're actually the ones providing the essential oxygen to fire us up, spark our imaginations, and just keep our society culturally alive.
And you know, this isn't a new concept either. Way back in 1511, the Dutch scholar Erasmus published a hugely popular work called In Praise of Folly. In it, the character of Folly actually praises herself, arguing that life would be completely unbearable without her. Folly brilliantly points out that intellectuals and philosophers burden themselves with so much heavy wisdom that they miss out on life entirely. She compares scholars to boring theater critics who just unmask the actors and completely ruin the performance of life. Even the strict religious figures of the time found this absolutely hilarious because it just rang so perfectly true.
Section 2. Enter the Court Jester. How they cured the isolated king.
Historically speaking, kings were entirely isolated in these massive echo chambers. They suffered from what's called a Fisher King wound, meaning they were alienated and paralyzed, surrounded by all the wealth of their kingdom, but completely unable to partake in its joy. They desperately needed a cure. So, society utilized two types of fools. First, you have the natural fool, who simply lacks social awareness and innocently blurts out the truth straight from the heart. But the hero of our story is the professional fool, the jester. Now, what's really interesting about this contrast is that the professional fool is highly aware, sharp as a tack, and strictly follows the mind. They heroically stepped right into that royal echo chamber to speak the absolute truths that those in power were terrified to utter, brilliantly disguising those harsh realities with incredible wit.
Now, we absolutely have to be careful to distinguish the jester from the trickster. The trickster is deceptive. They're all about schadenfreude, right? Taking pleasure in someone else's misery. A trickster laughs at you. The fool, however, is an entirely different beast. The fool deliberately makes himself completely vulnerable. He breaks the ice by laughing with you or even at himself. This courageous vulnerability strips away the social mask of the audience, allowing the king, or really anyone else, to let their guard down and receive a profoundly important message.
Let's look at the historical reality of who these jesters actually were. Frequently, they had some sort of physical deformity. Back in medieval times, dwarves and hunchbacks were often chosen because these physical differences were actually viewed as a special mark of the Lord. Functionally, they'd literally stand right next to the king just to make the monarch appear physically larger and more intimidating by comparison. But psychologically, their physical exclusion from average society forced them into profound loneliness. And through that suffering, they discovered unusual inner resources and massive psychological depth. It's exactly why Shakespeare's King Lear is so vitally dependent on his fool for wisdom and companionship.
Section 3. Speaking truth to power. The incredibly dangerous reality of the job.
You have to understand, delivering a reality check to an absolute monarch wasn't just a matter of getting fired, it was literal life and death. Because the absolute greatest secret of the successful fool is that he is no fool at all. In an era where just being authentic could totally ruin your reputation or end your life, the Jester occupied this brilliant paradoxical space. He was both an insider, living right there in the court, and an outsider, completely excluded from the nobility. This highly unique position made him literally the only person on Earth permitted to actively ridicule the king.
So, the crucial point is how they actually pulled this off. Well, they used a very specific toolkit. They would wear a mock crown and carry a scepter to playfully parody the king's authority. But their most important tool, by far, was the bauble. This was a full scepter with a miniature carved head on the end of it. It acted almost exactly like a ventriloquist doll. The Jester would use the bauble to say the incredibly dangerous, highly offensive things that the Jester simply couldn't safely say as himself. Combined with their royal immunity, this weird little loophole allowed them to deliver the necessary medicine to the monarch.
But make no mistake, guys, this was incredibly dangerous work. Humor was an amazing shield, but it definitely wasn't foolproof. There are actual historical records of jesters who miscalculated, pushed the boundary just a little too far with a highly sensitive monarch, and were literally beheaded for it. When there's an uncomfortable truth that simply has to be spoken, and those in power are terrified of it, the fool steps in. Knowing the fatal stakes makes their truth-telling truly, undeniably heroic.
And listen, this deep need for truth wasn't just for isolated kings. Everyday society needed it too. Take the medieval Feast of Fools, for example. All year long, peasant society built up these repressed hostilities. It's like a boiling pot with the lid left on. So on New Year's Day, the lower clergy would suspend all normal social conventions. They inverted the power structure completely. Sacred rituals were parodied, church authorities were openly ridiculed, and the underdogs finally got to vent. It was a structural, necessary pressure release valve required to prevent actual violent uprisings, even though the church eventually panicked and drove the whole thing underground.
Let's move to and see how this builds into Part 4, Embracing Your Inner Fool. Pivoting over to our own modern minds for a second. Back in medieval times, it was widely believed that keeping a fool on the premises actively warded off the evil eye. But honestly, this isn't just some antiquated superstition, it's a deep psychological truth. It is usually a very good idea to place the fool out front. We literally have to make room for the renegade faction within our own inner courts. We absolutely need that internal jester to challenge our rigid ways of thinking and bring us fresh ideas and new vital energy.
Because if we don't, we face a pretty dire consequence. Without a fool's blunt observations and essential playfulness, our inner landscape just becomes a sterile wasteland. If we refuse to embrace the archetype of the fool, we become completely paralyzed by the fear of uncertainty. We fall into endless looping rumination, and we let the boring, totally safe voice of conformity dictate our entire lives. We basically become that isolated king trapped in his own echo chamber.
Which really brings us to the climax of this explainer, captured perfectly by the legendary Russian writer Fyodor Dostoevsky. He said, "The wisest of all, in my opinion, is he who can, if only once a month, call himself a fool. To be a true, complete, whole person is to play the fool. Actively acknowledging your own ignorance and allowing yourself to be totally vulnerable and playful is the absolute highest form of wisdom. For sure, it is the only real cure for our self-inflicted isolation."
So, I want to leave you with this final, hopefully provocative thought. How are you allowing your own inner jester to challenge your status quo? Are you taking yourself just a bit too seriously? Are you trapped in an echo chamber of your own making? I think it's time to stop fearing the judgment of the crowd. Let your guard down, and finally let the fool speak.